ungakhetwa kanti ufuna ukuphaka utye imali leyo yakho imali yakho igama layo kuthiwa yisalary ukukwathatha imali leyo salary awukho ethical ufuna unikwe omnye uminister osengxakini ekuthiwa nguminister umculo funeka udibane nomculo once uthatha imali leyo salary yakho uyigale epokothweni yakho ndityalitwa nomculo simple now. So it is quite important therefore Comrade Ukuthi masincedane ngalento because we are going to kill the ANC.
Speaker after speaker praised Mabuza, his children and family, spoke fondly of the memories they will cherish and how much time they sacrificed without him at home due to the demands of his work.
We've received a lot since our father's passing, the visits, the prayers, the shared memories. Every act of kindness has reminded us how deeply he was loved. We are humbled and we thank you. Many of you knew him as a leader, a comrade, a colleague, but today we want to speak of the man that we knew at home, the father who raised us, who taught us, and believed in us long before we believed in ourselves. He was layered, and he could be stern, yes, but always with a purpose. He wanted us to be strong, to be independent, to be ready for a world that would not give anything freely. He expected us to work hard, to think clearly, and to be ready to stand behind our own words. He told stories of how much harder it had been for him, and he didn't do this to shame us, but to show us how far he had come and how much further we could go as his children. Those stories made us value the life that he built for us, the safety, stability, and opportunities. He gave us a life that he never had.
Mabuza will be laid to rest in a state funeral on Saturday, following a week of mourning as South Africa's flags were flown at half-mast in honor of the former school teacher. For Channel Africa News, I'm Dimakatsa Leshoro in Johannesburg.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet. Channel 628. Get Channel Africa on DSTV Audio Bouquet. Channel 802. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
13 minutes past 9. In just a moment, we'll be talking to you about the case of what's been described as patronizing diplomacy. Here we're talking about U.S. President Donald Trump meeting with 5 West African leaders. What are the hallmarks of that and what is behind that? Is it a trend when the U.S. deals with Africa, particularly given the fact that it's seen as donor number one when it comes to aid funding? All that and more coming up. But for now, we talk about what's been called the deadliest attack this year in Mali. More than 40 soldiers being killed there in a major assault on a military base early in June, with terrorist groups growing bolder and spreading across the Sahel. Military forces in the region are struggling to respond. Joining us now to speak about what's happened is Dr. Olayinka Ajala, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Leeds Beckett University. He recently explored these developments in an article for The Conversation titled "Why Attacks on Military Camps in the Sahel Are Increasing." A very good evening, Dr. Olayinka Ajala. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So how would you answer that question in a nutshell?
As I said in that article, which you mentioned right now, in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in attacks, not just random attacks on individuals and communities, but also attacks on military bases across West Africa and the Sahel, especially in Burkina Faso and Mali. There was also one that was experienced in Togo last year. So there's been an increase in attacks on military bases. And I believe there are a couple of issues. The first one, I think, is because of the loss of surveillance. You know, due to the military takeover in some of these countries last year, especially in Niger, the largest drone base in Niger Republic, which was in Agadez, operated by the United States, is no longer in operation. And this was a major base for surveillance and for also reconnaissance activities across the Sahel. So it's a major reason why I think these groups have been emboldened, because they believe they're no longer watched as they were when the base was in operation. The other issue I mentioned again in the article was also the issue relating to human rights abuses, which has increased the recruitment into the folds of the terrorist organization. So we've seen paramilitaries, we've seen non-government organizations being harmed, vigilantes that are involved in counterterrorism, and some of these are involved in human rights atrocities, which is then backfiring now, increasing recruitment into these groups. The other issue is also the issue of financing. We've seen that the terrorist groups are getting more ways of financing themselves. We've seen around drilling of natural resources and things like that. So they've changed their tactics in a nutshell. We've noticed that they believe attacking military bases will reduce or dampen the morale of military officers, and also put fear in the hearts of people to believe that they cannot be protected by these military officers and organizations.
So let's look back at first, as you mentioned, the presence of particularly foreign military troops, and I'm looking at the Americans, the French, and at some point Russian militia, quote unquote, groups. And there's also what was the presence of multinational joint task force groups. What role were they playing that has now created a chasm or a vacuum?
Yeah, they played different roles in different areas. So let's start with the multinational joint task force around Lake Chad Basin, and which covers Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. They were able to reduce militant and terrorist activities around that region since they were formed, or they were reformed in 2015. The second one is the G5 Sahel. So the G5 Sahel was sponsored and funded by France. And this involved Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and the other two countries in the region that were involved in the fight against terrorism. So they also played a significant role in the Sahel. But the most important one is the United States. And when we talk about foreign military agents or foreign military forces, the United States operated the largest military drone base in Africa, which was in Agadez. And from this base, they were able to fly drones, which were used for surveillance. And then they harvested the information from the drones and then shared them accordingly with partners or partner countries across the region. So just the mere idea that you're being watched is a deterrence to terrorist organizations. So since the drone base ceased operation when the military junta took over in Republic of Niger, the terrorist groups have been emboldened, because now those countries don't have those kind of capability or capacity to be able to survey this vast area of land across the region. And then we've also seen that foreign military troops that were training the locals or the local armies have also left. So nothing is replacing all this. So if you have a vacuum has been created, which is not been filled, and this has emboldened terrorist organization to launch further attacks and also to attack military bases in large numbers.
You've been studying the formation of these terrorist groups, and on the one hand, you say these foreign forces themselves either helped embed, germinate these terrorist forces, and you also spoke about human rights abuses, and what you say you've seen as a trend of those who are fed up with the presence of these terrorist groups have themselves been ripe for recruiting to fight other terrorist groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. I've been researching the formation of insurgent groups in West Africa and the Sahel for over a decade now. And we've seen a lot of changes. We've seen some periods of gains. We've seen different tactics being used. And one of the tactics used is the use of vigilantes. So a lot of countries, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, many of these countries, because of the topography of the areas and the huge land area, there are so many ungoverned areas, or what we call alternatively governed areas. So these are areas where the government do not have 100% capacity to govern and to protect. So in those areas, either the vigilantes are formed themselves and they are self-governed, and then they try to protect their own interest. Because terrorism affects everybody. It doesn't just affect the central government in Bamako or in Niamey or in Abuja. It affects everybody. It affects people outside of the country's capitals and even in rural areas. So some of these countries have been able to form vigilantes, which are paramilitaries. Some of them are even actually embedded in the military for reconnaissance, for intelligence gathering, and in some instances even for direct fighting against the terrorists. But the problem is many of these people are not well trained. They are not trained. Recently, Human Rights Watch released a document or a report on human rights abuses carried out by soldiers in Burkina Faso. But when you dig deep and look at some of these things, a lot of these human rights abuses are actually carried out by the paramilitaries, by the vigilantes. So if they are embedded haphazardly, and this creates a problem, the question is, if you are going to embed vigilantes or paramilitaries into the military, then they need to be trained on the rules of engagement, and then they need to also understand the tactics. But again, on the flip side, it's difficult because some of these people are affected personally or emotionally. Some of them have had their cattle stolen or their family members killed, so they have personal interest. So when they catch suspects or terrorist suspects, rather than handing them over to the forces or to the government, they take action. They take they commit jungle justice because of the personal effects. So all these multiple layers of issues needs to be looked into in order to fight the terrorism in the region.
So let's talk about that, because on the one hand, we have seen criticism against the Sahelian military for their ascending to power in non-democratic ways. And you say these very military agencies are unable to protect themselves against the growing terrorist groups because they are not adapting fast enough. So it goes to the heart of the issue of what the rationale is for having a military, because I understand that it is to protect sovereign nations. But it seems like while the two operations may be militaristic in nature, but what is the end goal? Because it's about fighting for power. So the ascendancy is somehow related. And I'm not sure if you understand what I'm saying, but I suppose what it goes to is the terrorism funding avenues that exist for this to be, a never-ending cycle.
I totally understand what you're trying to say. So when you look at those three countries, for instance, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the military seized power on issues relating to security. So they cited corruption, they cited lack of development, they cited poor governance, but primarily they cited insecurity. All of them cited the same thing, and they promised to fight insecurity, especially the scourge of terrorism. But now they are also realizing that it's not as easy as they felt it would be. And fighting terrorism requires a joint action. It requires international, multi-dimensional actors coming together. Because the area we're talking about, these are huge areas, lands that are alternatively governed or ungoverned. And now the military juntas are realizing that, well, it's very difficult. It's not as easy. The Alliance of Sahelian states, for instance, they said they were going to institute, I think, a 4,000 or 5,000 strong military among themselves. but the logistics, the funding, the parameters have been difficult for them to work out in the last couple of months. So I think they need to realize and understand that, well, not only that they can not fight these organizations by themselves alone, they need to find a way to work with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and have a framework in place, because now the G5 Sahel is gone. The multinational joint task force is weakened because Niger pulled out last year or early this year. So when you look at these structures that have been put in place for over a decade, that have crumbled without any organization or any structure replacing it, then we can see why the terrorist groups are having the upper hand.
I mean, a very interesting thing is playing out in the United States at the moment, where we see US President Donald Trump in DC meeting with 5 West African nations. And we spoke about the role of the United States in some of these conflicts, whether it's through peacekeeping or actually the funding of some of these terrorist groups, whether transparently or not. And one wonders then about the role of illegal mining and the proceeds thereof, because one of the things at the center of the talks with the United States is the commercial role that they can play bilaterally, and minerals, we know, are at the center of it. Is it something that we ought to worry about, given the criticism of the genuflection by some of the West African leaders when speaking to the US president?
Yeah, absolutely. The role of natural resources is very important. And when we look at what is happening now, I personally, I'm afraid when I look at the trends and dimensions. When we look at oil and gas and the role oil and gas play in the stabilization of countries and communities across Africa, now the same thing is happening the second time with the green economy, the green resources. Africa has 30% of the green resources which the world needs to move to green energy. Now, terrorist groups are taking control of some of the extraction of these resources. And this is a major way of funding for themselves. Previously, the funding used to come from taxing the locals or kidnapping, mass kidnapping and the likes. But because there are no longer a lot of expatriates in the region to kidnap anyway, or even there are not a lot of money the locals can give. So to sustain the huge resources that are needed by these terrorist organizations to begin to function, to fund themselves, to feed their fighters, and to buy weapons and logistics, they need other sources of funding. And then we've seen that the extraction of natural resources is a major one. So this is something that needs to be looked into. The question is, who are they selling these natural resources to? They don't sell them within Africa. They are selling most of them outside of Africa.
Absolutely.
So that means directly or indirectly, funding is coming from outside through illegal trafficking of natural resources and of weapons and all the likes that are funding and sustaining these groups. And this needs to be looked into.
Dr. Ajala, unfortunately, we have run out of time. We would have loved to chat more, but thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts. Dr. Olayinka Ajala, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Leeds Beckett University. It brings the time to just about 29 minutes past 9.
When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk. Channel Africa, the best nighttime radio.
Você é fluente em português? É apaixonado por rádio e quer trabalhar na África do Sul? Você tem documentos que o qualificam para trabalhar na África do Sul? Nesse caso, podemos ter uma oportunidade para você trabalhar no Canal África. Envie seu currículo e demonstração para Canal África @ newsroom@channelafrica.co.za. Lembre-se, se você não receber alguma resposta nossa em 14 dias, isso significa que você não foi selecionado. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
Parlez-vous couramment le français? Êtes-vous passionné par la radio? Et êtes-vous qualifié pour travailler en Afrique du Sud? Envoyez-nous votre CV et votre 3 minutes démo en MP3 à @channelafrica.co.za pour avoir une chance de rejoindre la famille Channel Africa. Si vous n'avez pas de réponse après 14 jours, cela signifie que vous n'avez pas été retenu. Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Nelson Mandela taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it.
We should all bear in mind that the greatest glory of living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time you fall.
This Mandela Month, Channel Africa salutes everyday heroes. On Channel Africa, the African perspective. Catch us on Satellite Channel PAS 10. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
At 29 minutes to 10, we continue with our look at U.S.-Africa relations. U.S. President Donald Trump hosting 5 West African leaders at the White House on Wednesday, touting trade and investment opportunities. But the meeting has drawn criticism, not just for its substance, but for the tone. Some of Trump's comments, including questioning Liberia's president about his English, have been labeled patronizing and disrespectful. What do such interactions say about how Africa is perceived on the global stage, and how should African leaders respond? To speak more about this, Professor Carlos Lopez from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town, an economist, author, and one of the continent's leading Pan-African thinkers, joins us now. A very good evening to you, Professor Lopez. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I mean, I'm sure you have seen the responses on social media, let alone from Liberians. Liberians actually just balking at what they've seen happen, cringeworthy given, and it boggles the mind that they've been speaking English since the 1800s, but their origins, they are former American slaves who founded this country on the continent. So what does it say about U.S. President Donald Trump, America's view of Liberia, let alone Africa?
Well, good evening. I do think that there is, in fact, analysis that should be done in terms of form and content. In terms of form, it's obvious that this was not only patronizing, but a colonial attitude of disrespect and lack of dignity on the part of the African presidents that participated in this show, particularly the picture that was done at the end of the meeting with one president sitting, Trump, and the others standing behind. So this is really not the kind of image that you would like to project in today's Africa that is trying to reaffirm its agency and is trying to demonstrate new credentials in the world scene. And then you have the content. The content is basically an attempt to try to have a certain number of countries that are not that influential. Maybe the exception would be Senegal, because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that it had a US base until quite recently. But the others are not really influential, and you would struggle to get criteria to justify their choice. But there is one reason why they were all together there. It was the attempt to basically get them to accept deported migrants to be expelled to their countries. And this would be third country parties involved. And I think this is really what President Trump has tried with South Sudan. It has not gone that well, although it was done. And now he's just trying to diversify his choice in terms of places where he can deport people. And the African leaders basically were trying to sell their minerals because they heard about the deal with Ukraine and more recently the peace attempts that were done by President Trump between DRC and Rwanda. It needs to be seen whether this is really going to hold. But basically, the transactional attitude of the president of putting minerals at the forefront of these negotiations made the African leaders think that this was the real reason they were there. I don't think so.
Well, as you say, there's conditionality and cooperation when you say we also need to examine the form. But You know, when asked about it, the White House said, well, it was a genuine compliment. But can there be a genuine compliment with such uneven power dynamics? It's clear that there is a perception or understanding of superiority. Therefore, one probably would be tone deaf when complimenting one's intellectual fluency, if that's what it is. But doesn't it just set the tone of also the African leaders, their reception of such condescension, that we ought to perhaps worry about what they're going to agree to?
Well, in fact, when President Trump said that he should just say their name and country, meaning that he doesn't even know that, he tells you how he feels about this particular show. In my view, this was lobbied by a certain number of interests within the U.S. administration, and he played ball because, he was told probably that this was a good way of doing something for Africa. And in this condescending way, he felt, this is the best he could deliver. And I think really what demonstrates this type of attitude is basically the neglect that Africa should expect from the U.S. It was not just the fact that tariffs have been imposed unilaterally in countries like Lesotho as high as 47%. Of course, South Africa just got another letter with 30%. But, the real reasons behind these tariffs and all these discussions is the unfolding of a new order. An order that is very transactional. It's not based anymore on the soft power and diplomatic efforts of the past, but more, deal making that is basically going to be, to a certain extent, unpredictable, and therefore it's not ruled by the same sort of principles and frames that we are used to. So you can have countries picked because someone told this or that, or for a variety of reasons that are not the traditional diplomatic circuit or diplomatic talk. So we are entering a period where volatility is going to be with us all the time, and where predictability is going to be weaponized. You never know what is going to happen next. So even these countries, maybe, in a couple of months or weeks or even days, can have something that is completely reversing what was the spectacle that we just saw.
And from what you're saying, are you suggesting that we're going to see a further eroding of Africa's collective bargaining power, irrespective of the institution that, we see with talks around whether U.S. President Donald Trump will attend the G20. So the lack of mutual respect has already been made clear by not only flouting of invitations, but not even bothering to explain the no-show. So is this what we should expect going further? And by the US president pointing fingers at particularly countries in the global south to say, if you are BRICS aligned, be very clear that you're going to suffer the consequences.
That's very clear. I think, this warning when the BRICS just met in Brazil was very indicative of this new state of mind where you punish the ones that are not with you. It's an approach that is based on a zero-sum game, where you don't see win-win. You see us and them. You see your win against someone else's loss. And therefore, if you are not with me, you are with China kind of approach. And obviously, the African countries have to exercise caution in approaching the superpower that the US is. But at the same time, they should try to basically be a bit more sophisticated in the way they deal with it. For instance, when all these different tariffs were announced and AGOA sort of fall between the cracks, what the African Union should do and should have done and still can do, it's basically to organize a collective African response. Because we have a continental free trade area, we should negotiate on trade issues as one. But instead, what you saw is a proliferation of aggregated demands by different actors and in an atomized way. So we really have to counter that type of attitude because we are not going to win that way.
And obviously the use of sanctions and other coercive measures, we've seen that particularly if we talk about the utterances towards South Africa. But my concern is that the imbalance of power is always made clear to African countries, because it's always been told, well, you need to consider what soft power you can bring to the table because you don't have anything else. So the colonial mentality continues. Even if we talk about Europe, you speak about a united front, but when it comes to negotiations of the EPAs, we've seen a lot of African countries fall under pressure because they're thinking of what national interest. But the question is there room for a pan-African views, unity, a solidifying of that in the very current funding resource constrained environment?
Well, there is. In fact, when you think of Africa not as a commodity exporter, which unfortunately we still are mostly, but as a market that has consumer capacity that is going to grow quite significantly. Our middle class now is larger than the population of Brazil. So if you think in those terms, it's going to be impossible to ignore this market. The same way it was impossible to ignore the Chinese market at a given point and then the Indian market today. It's just too big to be ignored if you are one. If you are not, if you are fragmented, like for instance with the European Union, we have 13 different trade arrangements, you become completely fragmented and you have no power, no bargaining. We are the third largest trading partner of Europe, but that doesn't show because we have 13 different agreements. We are more important than Japan. We are more important than all of Latin America and the Caribbean together for Europe. For the United States, it's a slightly different story because we are mostly engaged with the United States in digital dimensions and services areas that are going to be extremely competitive in the future and where the Chinese and the American are at the loggerheads. So the Africans need to start basically understanding their data sovereignty, and now they are going to bargain also in the digital world. Right now, they are signing agreements without even knowing sometimes the implications for the future with artificial intelligence, with quantum computing that is going to destroy the way we deal with encryption, and it's going to create huge, incredible opportunities market-wise, but also difficulties and challenges that we are not ready to confront if we don't organize ourselves. And it's going to be very difficult to do it one by one. So if we want to go in the direction of structural transformation of our economies, which is basically industrializing Africa much more, the first port of call is ourselves. It's our markets, the same way as if we are dealing with the that you raised about capital and access to funding, we should call on our own savings. We have a lot of savings that are not being used properly. We should never forget that Africa is a net exporter of capital, which means that there is every year more capital that goes out of Africa than comes to Africa. And that is because of the way we deal with our management, the way we deal with our pension funds, our sovereign funds, the way we basically borrow instead of, creating mechanisms like capital market instruments that are going to protect our own savings.
I mean, we're already halfway down that line. That is, of course, if we keep with the commitment, if we look at the AFCFTA, but there are still some hurdles to overcome there. So the question is, what will it take? We're hearing that the US president is possibly going to announce a larger US-Africa summit in September at the time of UNGA. So then I suppose choices have to be made then. Are we going to strengthen ties with other global south countries, including with the growing BRICS organization? Are we going to put more time and effort into strengthening the AFCFTA? And do we have enough political will for that?
I think right now there is a bit of a disruptive moment. Hunger is around the corner, so I don't think there is enough time to organize ourselves to have common positions. If there is a summit, it's going to be a very symbolic summit. It's not going to be a substantive one. So I would let that one pass. Mm-hmm. I don't think, we should raise expectations in relation to the next encounter. But that does not preclude the need for us to get ourselves organized. For instance, right now we should launch 2 or 3 initiatives that are to be approved by the next summit of the AU that is going to take place in February next year. So we have not enough time, but enough efforts can be put together for us to start putting, the engine of using our savings behind our different proclamations and will. A continental free trade area is going to be a success if we count on African markets first. If we always think that someone is going to help us, let's not kid ourselves. We have 6 decades of development aid. What they have produced is basically a continuation of the structural arrangements that were in existence during the colonial times, basically commodity exporting.
Okay. Prof, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated your insights. Professor Carlos Lopez from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance based at the University of Cape Town, basically encouraging African leaders to put the begging bowl away. What are we talking about? We're speaking about the meeting in Washington, D.C. of 5 African leaders who are meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump to speak about trade and investment, as he said. But what we saw was a case of patronizing and disrespect. All that we'll continue to, of course, analyze. But right now it is 14 minutes to 10.
Africa's very own think tank. This is Channel Africa Online. www.channelafrica.co.za. The Morning Switch Weekend with the Shy Guy.
The Shy Guy, a Morning Switch.
Have you ever listened to a song and then it gives you goosebumps? Because it takes you way back in the 80s. My goodness. Hey, baby. You hear Yvonne Chaga Chaga there. I want to talk to the DJ. And then the DJ goes like, hey, baby, I've got you on the other side. Huh? There were no WhatsApps then, right? There were no sliding in the DMs at the time. Oh, man.
Your weekend mornings are activated with the Shy Guy on the Morning Switch. Africa, meet Abedi.
Yeah, that's me.
Abedi is a music lover through and through.
I really love African music.
He's got a taste for all kinds of tunes and spends his days listening to Channel Africa. Guess what? He didn't know.
Okay.
Channel Africa wants to help Abedi and all music lovers everywhere to discover even more incredible music. That is why Channel Africa is calling on all African musicians to submit their music. Musicians, remember to give us all your relevant information. Make your submissions at music@channelafrica.co.za. Submissions are your chance to be heard on radio. But sadly, they do not guarantee that you will be playlisted. All submissions will be carefully reviewed to see if they meet our station's requirement. Channel Africa, the African perspective. We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet. Channel 628. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
11 minutes to 10, we are rounding off Africa World Hour as we've been bringing you up to speed with some of the latest happenings in and around the continent and beyond. We've been speaking about what's been happening in Washington, D.C. It's been the subject of much commentary around the world. U.S. President Donald Trump complimenting the Liberian president about his English, complimenting how well he speaks. And we've also seen the leader of Senegal say to President Trump that, they would like the US to invest in golf. In in the West African country because of President Trump's own aptitude on the golf course. And we'll be just asking all of this whether this is good and healthy for Africa, this patronizing, disrespectful approach, this begging bowl that it seems African leaders are either submitting to or are being forced to go with. So we will talk about the plight of inequality on the continent as well. We're hoping to speak to Oxfam. It's revealed a very stark rise in inequality across Africa, showing that just 4 of the continent's richest billionaires now hold, listen to this, a combined $57.4 billion US. That's more than the total wealth of 750 million people, half of Africa's population. And what are they doing, if anything at all, with the money that they have? So we hope to speak to Kwesi Obeng, who's accountable governance lead for Oxfam Africa, in just a moment. But let's talk about this. What is happening in Malawi? President Lazarus Chakwera commissioning $100 million US for Bakresa Malawi soya extraction and vegetable oil refinery plant in the commercial capital of Blantyre, marking a major turning point for Malawi's economic future. Tanzania-backed Bakresa Group Limited, which also operates in 9 other African countries, owns the plant. Chakwera says the plant is expected to reduce Malawi's reliance on imported cooking oil and ease pressure on the country's foreign exchange reserves. George Mango reports from Blantyre.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet, Channel 628.
Malawi is now poised to shift from being a net importer of cooking oil to a competitive exporter. This is because the facility can process 500 metric tons of soya beans on a daily basis, thereby boosting local production and reducing reliance on cooking oil imports. However, Malawi will need to produce at least 150,000 metric tons of soya annually. While the facility's success depends on local farmers increasing their output, it also offers them a guaranteed market and long-term opportunity. During the commissioning, Bakresa Malawi Limited General Manager Venkatesh Rao Patipati complained that the plant's opening had been delayed since 2023 due to forex challenges and bureaucratic bottlenecks.
Your Excellency, this is an export-oriented project. As we all are aware, Malawi's chronic trade deficit largely stems from exports not keeping pace with imports. This factory, by processing soybeans produced by our smallholder farmers, can significantly reduce the need to import crude oil. Moreover, it will enable the export of several high-value added products, thereby generating the much-needed foreign exchange for the country.
But in his speech, President Lazarus Chakwera said the refinery is not just an industrial milestone, but a strategic pillar for socio-economic transformation. The president said the investment aligns with the Malawi 2063 development blueprint, mainly its industrialization pillar, as it empowers farmers, creates jobs, and boosts forex reserves through import substitution and exports. He noted that while Malawi will now have the capacity to process nearly 800,000 metric tons of soya across the country, the question remains if local farmers would meet the demand.
What this factory does is to save Malawi millions of dollars in forex because of all the things made here that we do not have to import from other nations. What this factory does is to employ over 300 people, thus supporting their families with an income for feeding themselves, paying rentals, and educating their children. What this factory does is to provide our farmers with a ready market for their soya, because this plant is effectively an off-taker of what they grow. Because as much as 180,000 tons of soya can be supplied to this factory every year.
Minister of Trade and Industry Virumbiko Mumba was upbeat that the gesture by Bakresa Group from Tanzania is a vote of confidence in Malawi's investment climate.
Let me commend Bakresa Malawi Limited for its consistency and vision. From wheat milling to soap production and now to agro-processing, you have shown your confidence in the future of this country and the leadership of our president. This project speaks to your willingness to work with us from policy to production and to prosperity, the triple P's, from policy to production and to prosperity. And to all industry players, the message is simple. Malawi is not waiting, Malawi is building, and we invite you to build with us.
The commissioning of the Bakresa Malawi cooking oil refinery plant means that the Bakresa Group, which has its headquarters in Tanzania, has built a wide footprint across East and Southern Africa with operations spanning food and beverages, logistics, marine transport, hospitality, and media. George Mhango, Channel Africa News, Blantyre.
SABC Sports brings you Chasing the Sun, a powerful 5-part documentary series about the Springboks, telling the rousing tale of their path to redemption and ultimate World Cup glory in 2019. Starting 13 July at 7:30 p.m. on SABC2. Tune in every Sunday for the highs, the heartache and the heroics that made rugby history. Stream each chapter live on SABC Plus. That's anytime, anywhere. No subscription needed. Don't miss Chasing the Sun this Sunday at 7:30 p.m. on SABC2. Be there when history shines. And we end with this. The South African Reserve Bank saying that despite ongoing economic uncertainty, South Africa's financial sector continues to show resilience. However, the bank warns that a challenging macroeconomic and geopolitical landscape calls for heightened vigilance from financial sector supervisors. This was highlighted in a media hosted by the Reserve Bank and the Prudential Authority following the release of the organization's 2024-2025 report. Channel Africa's Innocent Samosa has this report, and that's how we end Africa World Hour today.
The 2024-2025 annual report highlights the Prudential Authority's extensive supervisory work across South Africa's financial institutions. Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank and CEO of the Prudential Authority, Fundi Chazibana, says as banks continue to reduce their physical presence, the Reserve Bank is intensifying its oversight to respond to emerging risks, particularly in the area of cybersecurity.
We don't tell you what to do. We ask you questions. Are you aware of the risks that you are now exposing yourself to? And are you able to manage them? So I'm going to talk about two very quickly and then hand over. So as you digitize, there would be potentially closure of branches, not necessarily in our forte.
Chadzibana says the South African Reserve Bank plays a key role in overseeing the governance and security of the digital financial platforms.
Is if now all of us are banking through our phones and there is a system outage, we would ask very different questions about the system outage as the PA relative to the FSCA. The FSCA would ask about you and I, the fact that we cannot bank. We would be asking about system integrity issue and what has happened on the prudential side, on the safety, because remember, you've now are using a new tool and you've got to understand the implications of it for your business.
Faisal Jina, head of the Risk Support Department at the Prudential Authority, shared insights on the impact of emerging risks and how they are being closely monitored.
And to the extent our unemployment is very high, consumers are experiencing strain, and that has an impact on particular lending institutions. But also on insurers in terms of lapse risk and policies being surrendered or just policy just lapsing. Some of the other things that we look at, they are linked. I mean, with the low growth story is also this issue around infrastructure, security, what impacts. So it kind of loops back to the low growth story in terms of is our rail infrastructure good enough? Things like water, power, those type of things, in terms of what impact does it actually have on growth, because ultimately it has a knock-on impact overall.
And these are the focus areas.
And that's how we come to Africa World Hour this evening. Coming up on Hotlines with Shayla Ndukumana, she will be looking at when the clutter in your home echoes the chaos in your soul, who helps you clean it out. She'll be speaking to Tabang Mashero, therapist and host of Asqoqeni, and Bright Junior Kamoto, author and speaker, as they speak about healing from the inside out, mind, spirit and space. All that and more on Hotlines later on.
Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark. Shayla Ndukumana.
Yeah.
Gang. Gives us some life.